Hi, I'm Evan from JZ Tech, and today I want to talk to you about Canon's RFS lineup of lenses. By neglecting their crop lenses, they are killing their crop cameras. Their wide-angle lineup is lacking to say the least, which is hitting the RFS mount's main demographic, the small content creators, the hardest. Stick around to find out both of what's wrong and how Canon could fix the issues this troubled mount has at the moment. Canon's problems stem from a lack of variety in their lenses, so when they release lackluster ones, it hits the great RFS camera bodies really hard. Canon's current offerings are an 18 to 45, 18 to 150, and a 55 to 200 lens, or a 55 to 250. All of these lenses aren't that great, but the worst one by far is the first one we'll talk about. The kit lens for the R50, Canon's cheapest mirrorless camera, is even worse than the older version for the same price. If we compare the 15 to 45 IS STM to the newer 18 to 45, the more astute of you would notice that the aperture performance is worse, which is very important for the crop cameras considering the fact that the sensor is smaller and you'll have to increase your ISO to compensate, and in turn your image quality will degrade if you're not shooting in perfect lighting. Another problem is that you're losing 3 millimeters of range, which doesn't sound like anything until you realize that you're losing 9 degrees angle of view. The kit lens for the R7 and the R10 and the most expensive RFS crop lens is the 18 to 150 3.5 to 6.3 IS STM. Again, Canon sells an EFM counterpart to this lens with exactly the same specs for the same price, which leads me to believe that this lens is simply a rebodied EFM 18 to 150 3.5 to 6.3 lens. Especially since this lens is aimed at people buying the R10 and the R7, it is disappointing to see Canon simply change the outside of their lens rather than making it longer, improving the aperture performance, or stabilize their performance. The telephoto lens of the lineup is even more disappointing. Like me, with even worse aperture performance than before. Compared to its EF and EFM counterparts, the aperture performance is underwhelming to say the least. It is between 0.5 and 1.5 f-stops slower than the EF version. For the price of this lens, you could buy a used 75 to 300 f4 to 5.6 ultrasonic, RF mount adapter, and an RF 50mm 1.8 stepper for the same price, and still have enough money to buy dinner. Yes, I checked. It's changes like this lens and the 18 to 45 that really hurt me. Canon is designing the next generation lenses to be actively worse than its last generation lenses, all while expecting us to pay the same price for lower value. Yes, this is worse than inflation is. It's not like it's not justified. I'm mad about this. Glass is what matters, and if I were to buy a crop camera, it would not be RF mount because the lenses are horrible. Considering that kit lenses have historically been pretty good to at least what they're compared now, this is disappointing. While they weren't super fast, they were acceptable with a half-decent focal range. At this point, I'd get an EF 18 to 55, 3.5 to 5.6 image stabilized stepper used, and EF to EOS R mount adapter. If I had a little more cash, I'd get an EF 18 to 135 IS USM to sacrifice some focal length for aperture performance, because it has that sweet, sweet nano ultrasonic, which is chef's kiss. It is perfect. It's amazing. At this point, either don't buy a kit lens or get a used EF lens and buy an EF to RF mount adapter. The RFS mount has a couple of gaping holes, one of which is the fact that the widest lens is a 28mm equivalent, which is garbage considering that one of the biggest draws for RFS crop is vlogging. I mean, this is what the RFS, or the R50 is for, which you really can't do with any of the current lenses unless you use an EF to EOS R mount adapter, and then your camera rig starts to be giant with that 10 to 24 ultrasonic. At that point, you might as well get a cheap DSLR. Another of the gaping holes in the RFS mount is the lack of fast lenses, which is appalling. The fastest lens for RF crop is f3.5 at 18mm on a $500 lens, which is beyond bad because Canon has regressed from its EFS kit days. The new kit lenses cost at least $50 more than the EFS ones, but have both worse aperture performance and less focal range. For example, the 18 to 55 3.5 to 5.6 image stabilized stepper costs $50 less, but for some reason was not chosen to be rebodied for RFS for some reason, because Canon, in its infinite wisdom, dreamed up a reason. Even any version of Canon's 18-55 lens would be better than the steaming pile of garbage Canon calls the 18-45 IS stepper. This leads me to the next issue. RF glass is disproportionately expensive when compared to EFM and EF glass. Considering that the RFS mount is meant to replace the EFS prosumer bodies and the hobbyist EFM bodies, not only is the glass more expensive, the selection is beyond bad compared to either EFM or EFS, and a bunch of other issues. The final issue I'll talk about for the sake of time is the lack of truly fast autofocus with ultrasonic motors. While some say that stepper motors are good enough, they just aren't as fast as the ultrasonic ones. Anyone who's used one can tell you that. Until this is fixed and maybe added to the 18-150, true professionals won't start using the mount. Because of this, ultrasonic EFS lenses like the 18-135 image stabilized ultrasonic and the 60mm macro ultrasonic won't have true successors, and won't have professionals using this mount, if to be completely honest. Although I've just talked about a few of the issues with the RFS mount, there are some leaked lenses that would help fill the gap. These lenses are predominantly rebodies of other lenses, but some are completely new, built from the ground up to perform well for the sensors on the cameras and the cameras themselves. Without further ado, let's look at the leaked lenses. I'm excited. The first one is an 11-55 f4 to 4.5 image stabilized stepper motor, which I'm really excited about. It may not have great aperture performance, but the 18-88 35mm equivalent focal length is more than enough to cover ultra-wide all the way to portrait telephoto length. This is the kit lens that we should have gotten with the R50, as the wide angle is fantastic for vlogging and shooting in small spaces. The second one is a 16-55 f2.8 image stabilized ultrasonic, a true successor to the EFS 17-55 f2.8 image stabilized ultrasonic. It's 1 degree wider, which isn't great, but I'd rather have it and not need it than need it and not have it. The more astute of you may have realized that the lens would have an ultrasonic motor, which would make it worth using to professionals. The focal length finally makes it to a 35mm equivalent of 24mm, which makes this lens a 24-85 equivalent for crop sensor cameras. Although this is an f2.8 lens, I'd not expect to get great bokeh at 55mm due to the fact that the focal length isn't that long, and I'd probably use a telephoto instead for portraits. The third one is a 22mm f2 STM, a directly rebodied version of the EFM 22mm f2 stepper, just for the RF mount. If this releases, I'll be expecting a 40mm f2.8 rebody from the EF version, another pancake lens for full frame. If they release this RF mount, it will be wider than the original EFM version, like physically, the diameter will be wider. So hopefully Canon will have room to improve the original lens's wimpy mechanics so that it can take more than one filter and hood. The fourth lens is a 32mm f1.4 stepper, another directly rebodied EFM lens. This one is rebodied from the EFM 32mm f1.4 stepper and is equivalent focal length is 50mm, the historic sweet spot for price, aperture, and performance. This would probably be about the same size or a little larger than its big brother, the full frame 51.8 STM, and would probably be better for people shooting only crop, otherwise I'd get a 51.8. Judging from the price of the EFM lens, it would probably be around $500, which is disappointing. The fifth and final lens is a game changer for crop photographers. It is a 32mm f1L ultrasonic. There's a lot to unpack here. First of all, it's a 50mm equivalent lens. Second of all, it would be the third in the world autofocus f1.0 lens. It would also be the first Canon L lens for a crop sensor. This lens would be probably costing somewhere around $1,500, considering that Fujifilm's pricing of their 50mm 1.0 lens is around the same place. If this lens was released, it would provide a great upgrade path for people using the f1.4 version, but considering the fact that this lens is such a weird lens to what Canon usually makes, I don't know if it will ever see the light of day. This could have all been prevented by one simple thing: allowing third-party manufacturers to make lenses. Canon, please! In fact, Canon has been so bad about third-party lenses that it hasn't allowed third-party lenses on the RF mount for 5 years of its existence. It's not like their third-party lenses developed for the RF mount. They just can't develop autofocus lenses because Canon doesn't want to give them the specifics of how the mount communicates with the lens through the 12-pin interface. It's Canon's stinginess that is killing its own crop RF cameras, which is a little ironic considering how hard it's pushing the RFS mount cameras, like especially the R7 and the R10. However, if Canon had third-party lens manufacturers, these are the lenses that would be the most interesting to have on the mount. The first one is the Sigma 18-35 f1.8 DC high-speed motor ART. This lens is one of the first lenses that comes to mind when I think of optical perfection. It's a crop zoom lens with amazing aperture performance of f1.8 continuous and very speedy autofocus. Unlike you may think, the glass itself is fantastic quality too. Second is the Tamron 18-400 3.5 to 6.3. Although the optics are hardly perfect, aberration and sharpness issues is this lens' middle name, the focal length is crazy. Its 35mm equivalent is 28mm to 640. So that goes from standard to ultra telephoto, which is just plain crazy. The astonishing thing is that it costs around the same price as Canon's RFS 18-150. The third lens is the Tokina 900mm f11, which isn't again optical perfection, but it's an ultra telephoto lens with a 1440mm equivalent on full frame. This lens would be really cool because it only costs $700, which is even $100 cheaper than Canon's own RF 600mm f11 IS stepper. I would suggest waiting and letting things pan out at Canon's next event, but hopefully they will try and make amends. If they don't, we could see Canon in the position of Nikon. Not dying, but trying to stop the bleeding. What do you think? Do you think that the RFS mount is doomed to fail, or that this lens mount has a great future? Tell us in the comments below, and thanks for watching our video. Goodbye. Okay, I swear, if you can't stop giggling,
Stop making jokes!
if I stop making jokes, the video isn't gonna be good. This is gonna, my funny is the viewer retention.